Did you see him repressing me? You saw it, didn't you?
All right, I'll provide that on YouTube so that you can actually see it. So we see here that, in fact, a move from kind of traditional legitimacy with the monarchy to questioning of that legitimacy, and the move to sort of rational legal legitimacy on the basis of a principle that supreme executive authority derives from, as the character said there, derives from a mandate from the masses. Okay. All right. So how do people exercise power? How do they give that mandate? Well, through participation, competition, and liberty. And participation means essentially voting, lobbying, running for political office. And when we think about competition, we think of political parties mostly and the separation of powers. And then in liberty, we think of freedom of speech and others. Okay, freedom of assembly, etc. So participation, voting in elections, true universal suffrage should be the situation. Now, once we argue that the people should vote, then the question arises: how are these votes counted? What type of electoral system? So this leads us to the electoral system, and this is simply rules that decide how votes are cast, counted, and then translated into seats in the legislature. And they're different across different countries. So electoral systems generally vary. They're one of two types generally. One is what's called single-member districts, or first past the post. This is also called the Westminster system, and then proportional representation. So in single-member districts, essentially the candidate with the largest number of votes in that district wins a seat. It doesn't have to be a majority, but it is a plurality. And those are two different words. Majority is one more than at least half the vote. At least half the vote plus one. That's a majority of votes. A plurality simply is the candidate with the greatest number of votes. It could be 10%. If you had a situation in which you had, say, 11 individuals running for office, 10 of them received 8% of the 8% of the vote, or let's say 9% of the vote. Or let's say 8.9% of the vote. Then the individual who received essentially 10% of the vote would win, right? Because that individual had a plurality. Now, votes cast for other candidates. So in that situation, right, in which the individual won with 10% of the vote, all the other sort of less than 90% of the votes are essentially wasted, meaning that they're not translated into seats in a legislative body. Okay, now obviously that's an extreme case, but in some single-member district systems, particularly in systems that are also parliamentary democracies, there is a large number of votes wasted. Right, in many single-member districts, say in Canada and in the United Kingdom, many times an individual wins with 35% of the vote, which means that the individual who has won and will represent that constituency in Parliament actually had 65% of the people, of the voters in that district, vote against that individual. So those votes are wasted, and I'll show you an example in a second. Proportional representation is different. You have are multi-member districts, so districts with more than one member, generally more than 5 or 10 members. And what happens here is generally the individuals don't vote for a party; they vote for a party rather than an individual candidate. And the seats in the legislature are ultimately proportional to the number of votes cast. Okay, so what that means is that if, for instance, in Canada the Conservative Party receives there's no proportional representation in Canada. In Germany, there's sort of a modified system with 2 votes, but generally in Germany what it means is if the CDU, the Christian Democrats, receive 40% of the votes cast across the country, then they will generally receive 40% of the seats in the legislature. And in fact, Germany has a way of, they have a 2-vote system. They have a way of apportioning it such that they actually get a legislature that's proportional to the votes cast, even though they also have single-member districts. It's kind of a confusing system, but generally, strictly proportional means that the number of votes cast is the same as the number of proportion of seats for each party in the legislature is the same as the proportion of votes each party received in those elections. Okay, so which electoral system is better, and which is more democratic? Can you think of advantages and disadvantages of each? Think about that for a second. So here's, I will post this actually. Here is the Monty Python, I can't remember his name now, John Cleese, who's talking about proportional representation and the England should, or rather the United Kingdom should implement it in the United Kingdom, because it would be more fair. Okay, here's an example of votes wasted in Canada from 1980 to 2004. Canada is a parliamentary democracy, but it has a first-past-the-post system. So you have here, for instance, an example of wasted votes. So there are a series of conservative parties. Now there's really only one again, the Conservative Party. The total vote for conservative parties over the elections over those many years was that. The number of wasted votes was that many. So in other words, the number of votes that were cast for conservative politicians that didn't produce any representation for the Conservatives in Parliament was this much. So almost 50% of votes. Actually, that's not true. Oh, okay, that's true. If this were the total, okay. Almost 50% of votes in the Conservative votes in Canada were wasted. 40% of the Liberal votes were wasted, and the reason that the Liberal is a little bit lower than the Conservatives is because the Liberal Party was the governing party for much of that period. Well, a lot of that period. The New Democrats, being the third party, had almost 80% of their votes wasted, and this is typically the case in parliamentary democracies which are first past the post. And the reason is because the New Democrats are a party that has wide geographic appeal, so they do run in every seat, but they are generally the third or second party in that seat, so they win relatively few seats, which means that most of their votes are wasted. The Bloc Québécois had only 24% of their vote wasted, and the reason is because they run only in Quebec, the province of Quebec, and as a result, being that their votes are geographically concentrated, fewer of them are wasted. The Green Party, of course, had every single one of its votes wasted because none of their members has ever won a vote as the fringe parties. Okay, so this is an example of a very large number of votes that is wasted in Canada, and in fact in all